hold music. You want to avoid it, and so do your customers. So say goodbye to hold music and hello to faster, smarter support with Salesforce. Make service more personal and agents more productive using built-in trusted AI. Then watch costs and wait times drop and satisfaction soar. Support customers in a whole new way with Service GPT. Learn how at salesforce.com/servicegpt.
Welcome to NatureBack podcast, where we speak with our guests about the green future. My name is Tarmo Virki, and in this week's episode, I'm speaking with James Vincent from Founder.
Hey there, I'm Merit. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Single Earth, and we are building a nature-backed currency to empower you to fight against climate change and biodiversity loss. Sign up at Single.Earth and be among the first to switch to a truly sustainable, nature-based economy. And don't forget to join the discussion around climate change and biodiversity loss on our Discord channel. Enjoy the show.
Today we have our guest, James Vincent, from a new fund called Founder. Welcome, James.
Hi, how are you, Tama? Thanks for having me.
It's a beautiful day in Estonia. I hope it's in the US, amazing day also.
Yeah, it's sunny in New York City. So it's often sunny in New York City. It's just bleeding cold, but that's the way it goes around here.
Beautiful. Tell us a few words about Founder. What's the background? And for the viewers, it's said as Founder, but it's spelled FNDR.
Yeah. Right. Well, my little gag is we couldn't afford the vowels. So that makes people remember FNDR. So if you take the vowels out, you get to, there's a big Chinese company called Founder that had the domain name, I think, way before us. So, we just pull the vowels away and there we are. We work with founders directly. I was lucky enough on my own to work with Steve Jobs in those seminal years between 2000 and 2011. So every week I was meeting with him on a Wednesday from 1 till 3 for 11 years. I could set my watch by the sort of what I was doing each day and what we needed to having 400 people all orchestrated around a weekly cadence of showing ideas to Steve and pulling the genius out of Steve to launch iTunes, then iPod, that turned into iPhone and the App Store and iPad. And so just sort of the digitization of media and then the microization of supercomputers in your pocket and the world as it is today, really. I think the platform that the last 15 years have been built on. And so I was lucky enough to sort of have a ringside, well, it wasn't ringside seat at all. I was fully immersed I was the wrestler on the field with Steve in a good way, I think, mostly. But tussling with ideas and communication and strategies to launch. Each one of those was something no one had ever seen before. It's like when iTunes came along, people were not paying for music. They were downloading online, LimeWire and Napster, apps. iPod came along and there were like MP3 players or there were CD Walkmans that skip, that have 1,000 songs in your pocket. Whoa, what the hell is that? What's this click wheel all about? Like, why do I need that? The iPhone comes along and everyone goes, oh, where are my buttons? What the heck? What's this screen doing here? Don't worry about it. You'll be fine. You'll be fine without your buttons. But the Crackberry and the Nokia people, were like, what the heck? And and then the App Store comes along and goes, oh, I get it. Right. There's an app for that. It's a Swiss Army knife. It does everything. And oh, I don't need my buttons after all. But, the first human impression. And so I think in all of that, and the reason I'm sort of laboring that is just, I've been through a few of these sort of seminal changes in technology and chapters and eras with, someone who could see around the corner, thankfully. So I wasn't that guy, but he was. And then I went on to work with Brian Chesky and AirBNB and introduced sort of a new way to travel by being a local and, living in people's homes and being, sort of resolving that paradox of being away, but being at home, feeling belonging and staying somewhere that feels, you feel at home in Estonia or in New York or wherever you're going.
Yeah.
And then our first client was Evan Spiegel at Snapchat, and he was trying to get out of being lumped in with the rest of social media because, Snap is ephemeral and they don't sort of utilize your privacy in the same way. And so that ephemerality actually is the source of long-lasting friendship because you're not lying to lots of strangers, which is what most people are doing on social media. You have a small number of people and you're being pretty honest. So Sorry, that was a very long answer to a very short question. But and so Founder is a company where we bring founders in and we take them through this, as learned along the way through some of these big founders, but also sort of intuition. And my three partners are incredible. One's a storyteller, one's a strategist, one's an entrepreneur, and I'm sort of the alchemist. And we take founders, our process is to pull the genius out of the founder. So we think the founders almost always have the genius somewhere. They're just not quite saying it right, or they're not quite segmenting it or sequencing it correctly or audience specific. So we really get into how to tell the story, whether it's, pitching, probably not your first, round of funding, but probably, an A or a B or C or somewhere in there. And then how do you think about audiences, and how do you tell stories where everything gets your talk tracks for different audiences, but everything gets to the same place. So yeah, we're helping storytelling, and we launched last week at Slush, or 3 weeks ago, whenever that was, a fund that basically sort of just extends the premise of what we do. We don't come in. I said very particularly, we're not venture capitalists. You don't come to us for money, right? You come to us for storytelling, and you stay and you get involved, and we end up buying into and LPs give us money to buy into, because we have access to some great founders, and we go on cap tables in order to carry on being storytellers throughout their journey. And particularly in this area of climate tech, I think the time horizons are just longer, and I think that's often why VCs are involved, but often family offices are involved, because they just have longer time, that's going to take 5 years, and that's going to take another 5 years. And that's, just giving a couple of examples of that, and stop me if it's boring. But 2 months ago, we launched electric airplanes, or we helped Heart Aerospace launch electric airplanes in Gothenburg. And that was, just getting on with it. We launched Hopium hydrogen cars at the Paris Auto Show in September, and I met President Macron. And these are, both of those examples are, you just have to start. Innovation is actually starting the process. You might say iPod, was the start. Let's just start with music, like Amazon start with books, let's build the big thing, but start with something. And I think sometimes people get a bit confused with the sequencing of messaging and want to boil the ocean and change the world, when all they've got is like a small piece of technology that figures out how to, remove carbon, which is great, but it's just the beginning, And so I think sequencing of messaging, particularly when there's this really meta, hydrogen isn't available for cars everywhere. Electric airplanes seem fanciful right now, but, the practicality of it. And another great lesson from Steve was always introduce the new with the familiar. I think often people, when they're like, oh my God, we're changing the world, so let's introduce new on top of new. And everyone's just like, I'll do that next year. I don't understand. Yeah. It's like, that's too much. Like, but your photos and your music, and you want that, it's in your app. Oh, I started with things that I'm familiar with, but this phone doesn't have any, but don't worry about the buttons. It's fine. You go into the familiar areas and people go, oh, I get it. Right. So, we work with Sweep, a carbon emissions company in France. We work with Sourceful, a sort of removing waste in the supply chain and doing sustainable packaging. We help them just sort of tell their story and use language that was relevant today, but had a sort of tip to the future. So putting your carbon on track was what we came up with Sweep, and creating a supply flow, not a supply chain, and it's simple language, don't be afraid of inevitable. Steve was always like, just because that 1,000 songs in your pocket is like, that's it. I'm like, no, that's it. There's an app for that. That's it. Oh, 99 cents for your favorite song. That's it. Don't be afraid of that. Everyone's always looking for these but actually the simple language is how to bring people on board. So
the sequencing comment you made was really interesting, because being involved in a climate tech company myself, and talking about the kind of long-term vision, which might be 10 or 20 or 30 years out there, it's quite a challenge to talk about something which is happening in the long term in the future, but something starting to grasp the first few steps or the first few years, what you're actually bringing to the market today. It's when there's a kind of maybe massive difference from the viewers or the or the listener's point of view, is quite a challenge in a way, the sequencing part.
Yeah, I don't think humans are good at thinking about their future selves, as we were just talking about, they're often like sort of surviving today, next week, and hopefully by the end of next week, and next year will take care of itself. And of course, these issues are increasingly pressing, and even though they're increasingly pressing, there's still people find reasons not to tackle them. But I do feel like these issues are more and more and more prescient, right? In culture, people are like, no. I get off a plane, I'm like, that felt not good. Like, how do I get to a place where I can get off a plane and not feel guilty? Or how do I remove the waste? Or when I open a package from Amazon, I'm like, I got to stop ordering from them. And maybe I should sequence them so they all come together. Or why isn't the packaging not plastic? And at some point, that pressure and consumer pressure and giving choices to consumers, I think oftentimes, and businesses, they'll make good decisions if you give them more choices. And there just haven't been good choices. I really think that has been the problem. And now, of course, you look at climate tech companies, and there are a million, in, I don't know, anything from packaging to ag tech to new materials to transport to forms of energy. I mean, you talked about sequencing. I'm going to give you a little model that might be helpful. And it's the way we think about it at Founder. It's a bit of sort of founder IP. So in our experience, when these very new sort of like long-term shifts are, and you're trying to figure out where you're at in that development, we think there's 3 phases. And the 3 phases are, the first phase, we call it a shock absorber. It's like, oh my God, right? So Web3 is in shock absorber. It's like, it's gone back actually even further since, crypto crash. But Web3 is in like, well, I don't understand, but maybe the new generation understands, like, the digital and the physical and the, but shock absorber is the first thing. And I might argue a bunch of climate techs in the shock absorber, right? We're just trying to figure out what that first step is. Then you're looking for a bridge. That's the second point. And the second point is like, I'm starting to see it now. Okay, so you laid the track, you solved some of those sort of immediate issues. I understand I need to remove carbon. You've got a piece of AI that solves that. Okay, I've got into the system. I'm starting to use it. Oh, now there's a thing that actually helps to remove that. Okay, because now I'm aware of it. Now you're beginning to solve it. Okay, great. And then the first phase is shock absorber, like avoid, kind of take the shock of the new issue. Then bridge is the second phase. And the third phase is springboard. So again, if I was to use the Apple 10 years, the shock absorber was iPod, iTunes, right? Oh my God, digital media, a small device in my hand. What the heck? Computers are these things that don't work very much and, big and cumbersome and silly. And then the bridge was the iPhone. You're like, wow. Oh, okay. It's all here. It's like a Swiss Army knife. It does everything. But how do I use it? There's no buttons. And so the App Store was the springboard. And of course, it'd be hard to argue that the App Store wasn't the springboard of the last 15 years of tech growth, right? There's an app for that. There's an app for that. There's an app for that, either business or consumer. And so I think if we were to look at climate tech, we would probably imagine that in most of those spheres, certainly in hydrogen cars, certainly in electric airplanes, certainly in mycelium foods or cultivated meat, certainly in carbon or in forms of energy or fusion, those different, or storing energy, or in removing waste from supply chain, all these issues that we know we have to solve, we're really beginning to be in the shock absorber, which is get people to adopt some of these methodologies and understand them on a human level and go, yeah, I'm removing carbon every single day. Awesome. Step 1. Now, step 2 is, okay, now let's, take you to the next level and create a bridge. And then we'll know when we're at the bridge that the springboard is pretty soon. So I don't know what the time phrase is, and don't pretend to be a futurist. But let's imagine a decade from now, and in Europe, most investments are ESG, right? Which in America they're not. Like this, they're horribly not, barely even compliant with ESG, right? So as more and more money, as that continues, more and more investment goes into this area. Companies and individuals have more choices and don't actually have the choice not to do it because the money's being funded to do it, because consumer pressure and culture is forcing you to do it, because technology is advanced such. I think the culmination of all those supply and demand issues create a sort of that moment where the bridge can happen. But right now we're in the shock absorber with climate tech.
It seems to me that basically all these things are actually going in the right direction. in a way, as the consumer awareness is increasing, the money to the sector is increasing, the brain drain also from the kind of old technology sectors to the climate tech is definitely happening. That we might be basically in a pretty good situation to move on to the bridge phase, as you were describing.
Yeah, I mean, the bridge, I don't know whether you remember, but, 2010 or 12, it felt like a bridge moment. It's like, oh my God, Uber and AirBNB and this and that, and fuck, I can press a button and the thing arrives. Look, my car's coming in 3 minutes. Remember that moment? You're like, what the heck? Oh my God, I just ordered something and it's arriving tomorrow. No, today. What the heck? Those like human magic moments where you captivate everybody, right? We're a few years off from that, because we haven't done the homework yet. We haven't shock absorbed the need for culture to absorb the new metrics of what's important in the world. Carbon or how much waste I'm creating, or is there a more efficient way to do that, or is there a way to remove plastics, or is there a way to eat better for the less animals, or just on a million levels. And we do know there isn't one silver bullet here, right? We need 10 million solutions, and every single thing you do. So I think that's why, I look at I was looking at a ClimateTech list for the UK. They're all relatively small, right? They're all, in there, they all proudly got their $8 million seed, whatever. And you're like, that's great. Probably, actually, that's the future, right? So valuations coming down, those numbers, they got a $3 million seed, they're probably proud. But and that's because we're in the shock absorber moment, and then you get to what VCs and others like to call sort of product market fit, where you're like, oh, this is now a business, and I've got 100 businesses doing it, and the big guys are doing it with me, and they're paying me on a regular basis, and they've adopted and understood. And then consumers come into work and go, why aren't we using that? Those moments where they go, whatever, 5 years ago, why aren't we using Airtable or Notion, or and then they go, Apple got into, without ever talking to companies, everybody insisted on having an iPhone. They were like, I want an iPhone, or one designed very much like an iPhone copy, but whatever.
I remember working at the big corporation at the time when everybody were using BlackBerries, and you started to slowly see the drain of iPhones into the global companies. Yeah. Interesting times.
But I think those parallels. It is always helpful to sort of go back and look at historical parallels and development of new. And I think that's the way to zoom out and see where we're at with climate tech, which is, I think, very encouraging. I'm excited for it. I think that actually the turmoil of the last year or so, and the tight, markets and investment philosophy, and some of the sort of silly hedonism of sort of crypto and just, Sequoia and people like, just like, whoa, what the hell happened now? I thought you were like the due diligence kings, and then you're now going to go back to this place where, a more measured approach, a more long-term, family offices have historically, I think, been taking a lead in climate tech because they're, they want to put
the vision is longer term.
They have a longer time frame, and VC structures tend to sort of push things to want to happen shorter. But I think as we increasingly get through the shock absorber and into the bridge, we'll start seeing bridges, and that's when the more sizable investments will come. Who knows in the coming years. So.
And I think also the kind of having that technology in the hand of consumers is one of those crucial bridges. At the point when you're having your first flight on an electric airplane, it's surely the kind of the moment when you start to actually understand that the world is changing around you. Yeah,
it's hilarious. I mean, that's often, it was funny. So I'll just tell you a little story. So Anders, who's the Swedish head of aerospace, I met him at Brilliant Minds in Stockholm this summer. And he was going up on the stage, and we should save his blushes by not telling the whole story. But and he's like, he came down and we talked a little bit about some of my experience, and he was like, "How did I do?" And I was like, "You got there. It was great. Like you got there, but you got there like right at the end. So we need to flip it. Like the thing you said at the end, you need to say at the beginning." And And he's like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, because the story is incredibly compelling, and that's what I mean by pull the genius out of founders. Like it's not that it's not there; it's just they haven't sequenced it themselves. And we're storytellers, right? So we're like, how do I get your attention? Transport, aviation is currently 2.5% of carbon emissions because there's 1 billion people flying. But we're selling airplanes to India, Africa, and China, and there's going to be 2 billion, and then 3 billion, and then 4 billion. And then it becomes 10, 15, and 20% of carbon emissions. So let's get solving this today. You got my attention. You got my attention right now. Okay, what have you got? Well, I'm launching in 2 years an airplane that holds 39 people that has electric engines. And you're like, wow. Now, your first thing you're probably worried about is, did someone plug it in? And at 30,000 feet, will the battery work, right? So don't worry, someone did plug it in. But more importantly, there's an auxiliary jet engine at the back. Okay, so again, introduce the new with the familiar. You know, I think that's probably, it's not actually a hybrid, but it's more there for safety and just reassurance. But again, back with the new with the familiar, right? If it was new on top of new, I got electric supported by electric, you're like, okay, no, I'll do that. I'll get some other people to fly it first, you know. At the last conference I was at, I think it was Web Summit, I asked everybody in the audience, 2,000 people, I was like, how many people would fly an electric airplane? And like a few people put their hands up, like, oh, I'm not sure. And I was like, how many people would fly an electric airplane if you knew there was an auxiliary jet engine? Everybody puts their hands up. So you have to figure out in culture what those things are that might be holding people back. And then don't be afraid to sort of get in there. And sometimes innovation is just starting the ball rolling, you know? And, you know, one of the things I think Anders was so smart about with Heart Aerospace, it looks like an airplane. You know, often electric airplanes look like these weird, futuristic, Jetson, bubbly. You're like, I'm not flying in that thing. Like some weird enthusiast with like 2 of his friends might crash it at a private jet thing. But no. If it looks like an airplane and it flies like an airplane, it smells like an airplane, just because it's electric, okay, I'm getting in it, right?
Exactly.
I mean, Steve, I remember we were figuring out what to call this, the phone, right? We had, 2 years of like, we had amazing names. Like, oh, we'll do this, we'll do that. And then, literally the night before, Steve's like, you know what? Let's not fight that battle. Let's just call it iPhone. Because, you know, we obviously talked about that, but because we've been calling things iPod and iTunes, and so we're calling everything something or other. And let's just call it iPhone. You know, Apple revolutionized the phone, because let's not fight that battle of it's not a phone. It's a phone. You know, 100 years of cultural history. You know, actually, we launched the iPhone with a commercial. It's called Hello. It's a beautiful commercial, actually. If you dig it up, it'll make you smile. 2006, it's coming. And it was basically just a bunch of incredibly famous people from footage, from like Robert Redford to like Mr. Incredible to like, everybody you love, you know, like, and they were all going, hello, 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 you know. And by the end, you're like, oh yeah, the phone. That's right. It's been with us for 100 years, you know, and it went all the way back to sort of, you know, black and white movies. And so you could see there was a historical context here. And you're like, you know, on June 25th, Apple will revolutionize the phone, iPhone. And then you're like, okay, I get it. It's the phone. And then when it arrives with no buttons, you go, well, it's a phone, right? Yeah. It hasn't got any buttons. Doesn't the phone have buttons? Okay, we'll tackle that now. But let's not tackle that of like, we called it a vroom. And then you go, it's a vroom. Have you got one of those vrooms? I'm like, oh, new with new. I'm never going to get there. So.
Exactly. That's a good point. I think in a climate tech scene also, and basically in all kind of forward-looking parts of the world, you every now and then see the projects which have nothing to do with today, and it's totally kind of incomprehensible for the audience or for the potential customers to understand what the hell this room is. Realities, right?
I don't know why I said vroom, but whatever. Just some silly word that somebody invented.
Probably somebody invented.
Someone's got a product called vroom.
Sorry to all of the vroom inventors in the audience. But the problem is very understandable, and it's very common probably in the sector. Any kind of good tips if in the audience people are building green tech companies, how to create brands for the company doing something good for the world? What should one kind of take into consideration? Yeah,
no, it's a great question. You know, I'm often asked this question because, you know, when do we work with you? You know, is it now or is it later? You know, obviously, we're kind of a peer-to-peer. So we're not the cheapest in the world, so don't do it like first, but like figure out your product market fit. And once you're sort of rolling, brand, I would say, is not something you get to in year 5. You're like, okay, let's get to brand now. It's like you're doing it from day one, right? So I would argue that every word, as soon as, you've already laid some track, but don't worry, it's not too late. But you're already telling the story, and the story is the brand. And so I think, the wrong way to look at brand is that it's sort of lipstick on the pig of something, and you're kind of like, oh, well, let's do the brand thing now. I mean, brand is everything you've ever done, right? So Steve was unbelievable. You walk in an Apple store, right? I mean, and you feel Apple because they're, it's smart. They're walking around with little iPods and they're solving, oh, you want one of those? Yeah, I got one over there. It's here, and someone comes out of a door and hands it to you and off you go. And I think every element of the brand, Steve had this thing where every product needed to create brand deposits. And so I'll zoom out for a minute. One of the things that we do at Founder is to figure out sort of we call it narrative-led strategy, right? So first, let's figure out what the dent in the universe you want to make is, right? Maybe it's 10 years from now, everybody's using this tech to change the world, and from businesses to consumers. Okay, great. Now let's work backwards. We're here today. What's the now? What's the next? What's the future, right? So the shock absorber, the bridge, and I'm throwing so many models at you, head's probably hurting, but right now, next, future, right? Right now we're here. What's next? What do we do next? And then what's the future? But I think oftentimes people get very romanced by the future, but not thinking about the next. And I think at the now and the next. And so, a brand is built brick by brick every single day, right? And so, I think the earliest you can possibly figure out what your overall intention is and your dentist, and then work back from that and say, this product is going to become, this product is going to be, right? And have some sense. I'm not telling you have to write out the next 10 year of product development, but some sense of the phases, right? What's happening now, what's going to happen next, and long-term, the impact is going to be this. If you have that and you start to make sure that everything is roughly on track with that, that's the brand. And then you start figuring out the words that you use as you're, doing podcasts with Tomo, or you're, speaking to investors, or you're speaking at Slush, or you're doing an ad, or you're on the website, right? Make sure that language is coherent, is disciplined. You're using the same language over and over again. Apple uses the same language over Airbnb. Like, you go on there, you're like, I bring my best human when I go to Airbnb. I'm always like, oh, hey, I'm in town with my little family. I love your apartment, right? No one, it's not TripAdvisor. It's like, she spilled my, the reviews are horrible on those travel sites, right? And suddenly you're in Airbnb and you bring your best human. And that's because Brian Chesky is a product designer from RISD, and he designed for good human interaction, right? So when you go to Airbnb, you first approach it in a nice way, and then they look at your reviews and say, oh, well, James hasn't trashed anywhere recently. So, everyone's giving him good reviews, so we'll let him in. And then at the end, the really interesting thing, and I think, again, back to this notion of brand versus product, because I think Brian's a wonderful example, even sort of more contemporary example of a brand built through great products. And, whereas Apple is sort of like, for the generation and the sort of technology and software and hardware, this is experiential, it's about in a world where people aren't, they're looking to have experiences. And so at the end, you come out and you go, you don't write a review and say, it was kind of shitty, that bit, but, I had a great time, right? You do a private review first, and that takes the venom out of your review. So you go, hey, Tomo, there's a bit of damp in the spare bedroom, and there were no whatever in the downstairs toilet, and right? And you say that, and then you push that out to them, and that improves the product, but no one sees it except you. And then they go, oh, thanks a lot, James, appreciate you, saying that. And then you do the public review, and then you go, oh, I had a great time. It was awesome. There were a couple of issues, but Tomo dealt with them. And you go, fucking ace, that's excellent, And so I think that's an example of a product experience giving a brand deposit to Airbnb, because every time you come out, you go, oh, I do like that brand, and because Airbnb isn't simple, there's some neighborhoods that, right? So in the discourse of social interaction, there are some neighborhoods that are like, we don't want any more Airbnb. It's like not helping, we can't live there anymore kind of thing. So a brand is there to defend you when you're not in the room, right? When you go, oh, Airbnb, and you go, okay, actually, I think they're good people. I think they're trying to do a good thing. So let's figure this out, right? And I think that's what a brand is there to do, is to stand up for you and to make people understand that, because there'll always be a wiggly moment at some point or a bad experience, and a brand is there to protect you when you're not there.
Going back to the beginning of your answer, what's the dent founder is there to make?
Founder the company. I mean,
yes.
The fund which we just launched, and I think we're in TechCrunch this week, and so we got a lot of, and I was like, the first thing I said was, we're not VCs, right? So don't come to us for money, come to us for storytelling. And then what happens is a lot of VCs have come to us and said, oh, can we be LPs because you have great access? And so, yeah, sure. And then we get on the cap table of these companies and stay with them. And so we get these little strategic investments, right? So it's just but I think the dent in the universe is always to work with very intentional founders that are looking to create a positive impact from the interaction between technology and the human condition, right? So I think we wrote that 6 years ago. And the positive impact is, we've said no to a few people. We never worked with anybody in crypto. I never met anybody I trusted. And I was just like, and my team was like, we could make money out of that. I'm like, yeah, it's just, we won't be happy. You won't like working with them. We won't like the product. I'll never want to talk about it. So it doesn't help us. I want to be able to talk about everybody we work with, right? Yeah. And so I don't say we're a purpose-driven company, but I think we kind of are in that
kind of
area.
Yeah.
I think half our products right now, half our projects are climate tech of some sort or other. I just mentioned a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
And increasingly, the more you do, and so, we're talking to an energy company yesterday, and I don't know, I think everything is becoming more and more climate tech. It's a bit like digital, 15 years ago, everyone was like, oh, you need the digital department. Well, the digital department just went away, right? Yeah. There is no such thing as a digital department. Everything is digital, right? Exactly. And physical.
There is no analog departments anymore.
Climate tech becomes that, but we're in the shock absorber moment where it's a category, but it becomes mainstream in the next few years. And that's very exciting.
So it's a good, right place to be at.
I think so. I mean, I think the cultural forces, government, legislation, culture, even Biden's stuff, where he encouraged this and encouraged that, that's increasingly going to be, once we get over the sort of energy crisis and supply chain issues that we're struggling with right now, which I'm sure you're familiar with being in Estonia. But, assuming that is a blip, right? And we get past that. Actually, I think in the long term, it has highlighted the need to move. In the short term, it's incredibly painful, right?
Exactly.
But it's a shock absorber, we need to move away from this thing. Oh, yeah, we'll do that later. Oh, we need to move away from this thing. Oh, because the supply just got cut off. Oh, yeah, shit, let's move away from it, I think that's a driver of faster change, not making it happen more slowly.
Slowly starting to wrap up. I think you kind of touched up on the point, but maybe it's good to repeat. What stage, what kind of companies are kind of best to turn to founder to ask for the advice?
We do projects that can be short or long. So depends on sort of what stage you're at and whether you want to sort of build a 5 to 10 year plan or you want to solve the next year or two. Roughly speaking, our projects go from 100 to 300. So just to get blunt, and it's a very fiscally tight moment. So everybody's asking that question. And so we would size it tailored on the need and the scope and the desire, right? So, obviously if you've got $10 million, $100,000 feels like, a larger button, or actually if you're absolutely, it's mission critical and you're not doing a good job telling your story, then maybe the best $100,000 you've ever spent. Because you will start to tell a story, particularly because in this area, storytelling is so important. And I feel like everyone's telling kind of the same story. And we often, I'll tell you, we do a really fun exercise. We always pull all of the words that are being used in your category from all the websites, and we should put it on one page. It's like the first exercise we do, we're like, see these words? It's what everyone else is saying. And actually you're using 80% of those words too. So let's figure out how to say this stuff without using those words, right? And so I think that exercise, so yeah, it could be early if it's mission critical. I would say mostly we're in sort of a Series A moment, 10 million plus is probably, where 100,000 or 150,000 makes sense. And then of course we work with very large companies that are very well capitalized and, can afford but have a much more complex series of issues in terms of product and in terms of and so we get very deep on the bigger projects with bigger companies. But I mean, we love early stage. We love we're very good dreamers, but we're also incredibly practical. And we turn that into, this is what you need to say on your website right now. This is how you tweet. These are the things you use on social. These are your handles. This is how you describe. This is the way you talk to talent, Narrative is all about getting great talent. It's about encouraging a great employee culture. It's about getting investors. And it's also about the customer and the consumers, and business messaging.
Exactly.
So all of those things, as early as possible, but typically around that sort of $10 million is, I don't know why I keep hitting on that number, but it feels like
sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and sometimes before that, just because it's existentially problematic that you can't tell your story. So sometimes people come to us and say, I feel like I could raise a ton of money if I could just tell my story. And we said, well, let's go. And that's what we do.
Good. Thanks, James, for this discussion. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I'm glad it was, I hope it was useful to everybody.
I'm sure it was useful, at least to some of the listeners. Thanks. Join us again for the next episode. Thank you for listening. If you like the show, please give us a good rating and leave the feedback in your podcast player so others will find it too. We will be back next week. Turn on to NatureBacked Podcast.
Welcome to Entrepreneurs Exposed, where we dive into the stories of visionary entrepreneurs revolutionizing the workforce. Our ongoing mission is to showcase founders and creators doing amazing things in business and beyond. If you're a founder, CEO, tech enthusiast, or someone generally interested in startup land, join me, Adam Leventer, as I dive into what makes an entrepreneur an entrepreneur. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
I could tell she was a dame who normally knew what she wanted.
I'm looking for something interesting.
But when it came to podcasts, she was lost in a fog. That's where I come in. The name's Guide, Podcast Guide. I'm the community search engine for podcasts, and I knew I could help her navigate the murky waters of podcasting and find the shows that fit her style.
Can you keep it down? A girl's trying to listen to a podcast here.
Head to www.podcastguide.us and let's solve this mystery together.
Electric acid.